Hello, everyone. David Miles here again. Today, I'd like to talk about immigration law as it pertains to civil versus criminal offense and due process and how that all ties in again together. So, first of all, there's a big debate about whether these illegal immigrants, undocumented or whatever you want to call them, whether they are subject to whether they're criminals or whether it's just a civil offense. Now, this is a situation the same like every square is a rectangle, but not every rectangle is a square type situation. It's actually both, can be both, not always. The difference is being in the United States unlawfully is a civil offense. That part is correct. Crossing the border without authorization is a criminal offense. So everyone who's in the United States who doesn't have legal right to be here is in violation of the civil immigration law. So that civil offense, everybody who crossed the border without authorization to do so, they can be subject to criminal offense of illegal border crossing. Now, a lot of you are going to say, oh, but they're just asylum seekers. What about asylum and all that stuff? Well, asylum is an affirmative defense to the otherwise criminal action. I covered that a little bit before, but basically an affirmative defense is I did something that is normally considered illegal. However, I have legal justification because affirmative defense. Self-defense is the same type of thing. I did a violent act against this person, which is normally illegal to do. However, I was justified in doing that because self-defense. That self-defense is an affirmative defense. So the thing about affirmative defense is it doesn't guarantee you're not going to be prosecuted for the crime. It doesn't guarantee you're not going to be arrested for the crime. In fact, if someone broke into my home and brandished a pew-pew and I got my pew-pew and unalived them first, okay, self-defense, but I would fully expect to be arrested that night and probably spend the night in jail while law enforcement investigates. I might even be prosecuted for what I believe was justified, but what they might say was some kind of homicide or manslaughter. But then when I go to court, I get to say, affirmative defense, yes, I did the thing, but I was justified because self-defense. That's what an affirmative defense is. So asylum is like that, but for illegal border crossings or even just being in the United States. It can be an affirmative defense for one, the other, or both of those things. Okay, now why does this matter? The other issue is due process. So there's been a lot of argument like, oh, they're criminals. No, they're not criminals. It's a civil offense. Well, here's the thing. Due process is different with civil offenses versus criminal. There is a different requirement when it comes to proceeding with court. The different due process for the two. So and I'll give you an example. Let's say a person who is many months late on rent goes and steals something from a store and gets caught. The officers arrive. They might give them a criminal citation. Rather than taking them to jail, they can do what's called a cite and release. So they give them a criminal citation, hand it to them. It has a court date. Say it's supposed to be, next Tuesday at 9 a.m. And it just so happens that the eviction proceedings that were already scheduled are next Tuesday at 1 p.m. So it's 1 in the afternoon so 9 a.m. for the criminal case, 1 for the eviction, which is a civil proceeding. Now let's say next Tuesday comes up, it's 9 a.m. and they call the person in court and he's not there. All that happens is the judge is going to ask some questions. Were they properly notified? The cops can say, yep, I gave him I cited him, gave him the court date, he signed for it, here's the signature. And then the judge is going to probably issue a warrant for the person's arrest, and it stops. If that was their first appearance, there is no first appearance yet. It stops because the person has to be there. In criminal court, the person has to be there for anything to proceed, with very narrow exceptions to that, such as if They just won't shut up in court, and so the judge orders them out of the room or something. But then that's a little bit different thing. Before you're like, oh, what, this, that. Okay, in just as a baseline, for criminal court cannot proceed without the person there. If the person skipped out on the court, they didn't show up, it stops until law enforcement can get them there. Now, so that happens, there's a warrant issued, whatever. And then 1 o'clock rolls in. It's time for the eviction proceeding. The person also doesn't show up. The trial still happens. It doesn't stop. The judge is going to ask, was he properly notified? Yes, we taped the thing to the front door. He wouldn't answer. So we taped it to the front, the summons to the front door. We took a picture of it. Here it is. Here's my signature from my process server who said they properly served on this date and time. Here's the evidence of it. The judge is all right, and they proceed. Because in civil proceedings, all that's required is the person was properly notified of the court date. They don't have to be there. If they're not there, it tends to go very quickly. And this happens a lot again in eviction cases. The landlord or property owner's there. The tenant who's being evicted doesn't even show up. And so the person representing the landlord, they say, here's the violation that justifies the eviction. Nobody argues different because the person's not there. The judge is like, all right, I have to believe you. It checks all the boxes. So they get evicted. And then the judge makes an order, and it's usually something like 5 days. They have to be out. If they're not, then sheriff's office can come down and make them be out. And at that point, 5 days passes, the person's sitting in there, won't open the door. Law enforcement has, with that not a judicial warrant, but with that administrative warrant or that order from the judge, they can now enter the place because that's no longer the person's residence because they have no legal right to be there, and they can remove them, yank them out of there, and make them leave. Okay? But again, due process. For criminal, person must be there. For civil, person must have been notified that they needed to be there. This comes in really big when it comes to immigration because you've heard of catch and release. There's a lot of catch and release. Catch and release is a term that media uses, that politicians use. Law enforcement uses a little bit different term. They use cite and release because catch and release makes it sound like they caught them. They said, okay, now get out of here. You can go. That's not all that happens. It's a cite and release. Law enforcement, Border Patrol maybe catches them, issues them a notice to appear. They sign for it, gives it to them, and then they are released. So when court comes around, immigration court, and they don't show up, and maybe when they're caught, they claimed asylum, the officer, all right, show up in court. Remember, the thing about affirmative defense is not a get out of jail free card. It means you can argue that in court, but it's not a get out of jail free card. So usually, a lot of times they'll offer 2 citations. One will be for the illegal border crossing, which is a criminal violation. The other will be the civil offense of being in the United States without authorization to be there. So there may be 2 different court dates, or there might be one court date. Usually it's one court date, and then the other one is you'll be contacted by the DA or whatever, or somebody. You'll be contacted about this violation of crossing the border illegal. That's usually how that one goes. So the immigration court date comes up, and they don't show up. Guess what? They get a administrative, because it's civil. They'll try them on the being in the United States legal. They get the administrative warrant to remove them. Basically, it's an eviction from the United States. They get evicted from the U.S. And so that means that now law enforcement gets to take them into custody and force them out. Just like in a regular eviction, law enforcement will enter the premises, grab the person, and physically remove them if they're refusing to get out. So that's what that's what an administrative warrant does. They already lost their case. They had their due process, and they lost because they never showed up and didn't contact the court, didn't say I'm moving to this other area. They did nothing. They didn't show up. The court date, the trial happened, and they didn't offer a defense because they chose not to be there. So due process is done at that point. Now, can they go into a person's residence, snatch them on that? No. A person's residence is basically sacred in the Constitution and in law. You cannot enter a residence without A judicial warrant is not the same as an administrative warrant, which they get from immigration court. But here's the kicker. Remember what I said. Crossing the border illegally is a crime. They might have said asylum, but that they can still be charged with that crime, and then they would have to argue asylum. So they can still be charged. So since it's a crime, if we can't get them outside of their home, if they were caught crossing the border illegally, if that was part of it, then they can be charged with that. They can go to a judge, say, they committed this crime of crossing the border illegally, and so we would like a warrant to arrest them. So then the judge can give a judicial warrant for arrest based on the crime, and then they can enter the person's residence and make the arrest if they know the person's there. Okay, so there's the difference. They don't go for those much because if they have the crime of crossing the border legally and also the civil violation of being here when they're not supposed to be, they don't want to waste their time prosecuting the crime. They just want them gone. So they'd prefer to do it under the civil court side. If they can't, because the person's hiding out in the home and won't leave, they many times, not always, but many times they have the option to go ahead and charge the criminal crime, take it to a judge, get the warrant, go in and take the person, and then, here's the sneaky bit, maybe you agree with this, maybe you don't. Sneaky bit is then after they've gone and grabbed the person based on the judicial warrant of arrest for the crime of crossing the border legally, they can then, once they have him in custody, like, yeah, we're not actually going to charge him with that. We're just going to exercise the administrative warrant and order of removal and get it, because we'd rather have them gone than going through all this criminal court process. And they can do that. That's the thing. They can do that. Okay? That's where the difference is. So I hope that helps understand some of this stuff as far as criminal versus civil and the difference in due process. A lot of people think due process means they have to have their day in court. Well, if it's civil, they do still have to have their day in court, but if they choose not to show up, court still happens. And they had their day, they just chose not to be there. Criminal court, it's not like that, but in civil court it is. And anybody who's ever done anything in civil law, that's why if you get called to civil court because someone's suing you, you better show up, because if you don't, the judge just has to believe everything the other person's saying. And you lose. You will lose if you're not there, if you've been properly notified. Okay, there's your difference. Hope that clears some of this up. As always, if you disagree with any of this, you have anything you want to, conversation you want to get going, put it in the comments. I do try to respond to those, and I'm always happy to have those happy debates. All right, thanks. Bye.